My name's Amanda Smith. I'm the presenter of the program Artworks on ABC Radio National, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this event with you here in the BMW Edge. This is one of the Melbourne Conversations series presented by the City of Melbourne. This one is in partnership with Museums Australia. It's the public part of the National Conference for Museums Australia that many of you, I imagine, are taking part in, that's going on all this week in Melbourne. Now, the four speakers joining us tonight for Museums and Collections, Are They Telling the Stories of a Diverse Society? Michelle Hippolyte. Michelle is Kaihotu Maori leader of Te Papa Tongaroa, the Museum of New Zealand, and as the name suggests in the two languages, it's a bicultural museum. Professor Stephen Heppel is the CEO of Heppel.net. This is a policy and learning consultancy. Stephen's based in the United Kingdom, mostly on a boat moored in the Thames, I have learnt. But also his work takes him all over the world. He tells me from Alaska to Israel to the Caribbean. And his special subject is online education. David McFadden is from the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. He's the Chief Curator and the Vice President for Programs and Collections there. And Professor Adrian Franklin is a sociologist at the University of Tasmania, and as I'm sure you'll know, he's also a presenter on the ABC TV program Collectors. So everyone's from overseas, be it the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean or the Tasman Sea or Bass Strait. Now, each of our guests is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and they're each, I think, going to take a very different approach to the question that's been posed. And after they've each spoken, I'll get the ball rolling with some discussion, and then invite your questions to extend the conversation. And there'll be a couple of roving microphones for you to use for your questions. I should also tell you that this event is being recorded for broadcast on ABC Radio National in my program Artworks, and it's also being filmed. And I also need to just quickly draw your attention to the survey that's on the back of your program. You can make comments there, and those comments are certainly welcome. And you can also have yourself added to the City of Melbourne's email list if you want to be invited to future events of this sort. Now, before I invite the first speaker up, I just want to share a reflection with you, the truth about what museums are for. Years ago, I was on a driving holiday with a friend, and we were going to see the Buchan Caves in East Gippsland in Victoria. And on the way there, close there, we saw a sign that said Buchan Museum. And we thought curiously, oh, well, that sounds interesting. Let's turn off the road and go and have a look at it. So we drove up this road and got to a house, a weatherboard house, just an ordinary house. And we went in, and inside the house, the woman who owned it had set up her own museum in there. It was full of things that she'd collected over time and from her travels. So there were things like shells, and I think there were some Indonesian puppets, and there were things she'd knitted and crocheted, I think. Anyway, just about the whole house was taken up with all these exhibits. And just like Sir John Soane's museum in London, it was a personal and idiosyncratic collection, and it was in her own home. So my friend asked her why she'd done this, why she had set up this museum. And she said, to get rid of my husband. She said that she was filling all the rooms of the house with all this stuff so that eventually there'd be no room for him and he'd have to go. So that's what museums are for, you see. They're for keeping what you like in order to get rid of what you don't want. Let's now welcome our first guest, Michelle Hippolyte. Michelle is speaking about an experiment, really, an experiment that started 12 years ago to make the National Museum of New Zealand into a place that represented the Indigenous and settler cultures of the country. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Hippolyte.
Kia ora and g'day. I thought museums were places for to drop children off when you need to do something else. I want to start and preface my comments for you tonight by talking about a movie. And it's a movie that is homegrown and made in New Zealand called The Whale Rider. And it set the context for an exhibition that we created, but quite interesting from various perspectives and different diverse communities. These communities were science, conservation, culture, of course, and the exhibition world. And it was our mission that, because we have a strong paleontology collection base, particularly with our whales collection, to find a way that we might bring these diverse societies together. And on the back of the Whale Rider movie, which went all around the world, premised on a cultural Māori story, for some a mythology, but for others a reality. It was our mission 5 years ago to think about how we might combine the worlds of science, culture and conservation, all in one space of 600 square metres. In designing and thinking through those diverse communities, of course we were contemplating, would there be contradiction and how would we work that out? Now, for those of you who know early settler history in New Zealand, a number of people came because they came to set up whaling stations and be part of the whaling stations in the far north, in the deep south and on the east coast. When the whalers arrived there, they were greeted by people on the coast who said that they were whale riders. They were people that had a relationship with these whales, and I think the whalers thought that they were crazy. That could this mythology be true? Could this mythology that appeared on Māori people's carvings, their homes, the places that they lived, could this be true? Could their stories and song that included ancestors that were whales be real? And as we in Te Papa explored bringing these cultural stories together alongside science and history, we learnt a lot about what it was to be a bicultural institution. In navigating our way through the creation of this interesting exhibition, which by the way is just left the Boston Science Centre and is making its way into Toronto, we learnt about how people come together for common purpose, even when they have diverse perspectives. The scientists that we worked with weren't just from New Zealand, although we have a very good paleontologist who's based in Canterbury University, who had done a lot of work about the evolution of whales, starting 50 million years ago and showing the evolution of the whales being land-based mammals and then over time making their way into the ocean. In that period, over 1 million years, we then looked at the cultural stories that indicate some of the people on the coasts, people came on whales, and tried to plot as much as we could where there was true commonality and, I suppose, explored where the myth really had a place in museums. We then looked at conservation because, as I said, being a whaling nation, we've done a pendulum swing now and we're a conservation nation. We're promoting conservation and the conservation of whales. And we presented that even though our history starts as being a whaling nation, that actually over a period of time we have become a nation that promotes conservation. Now, I try and present this all together and enable a visitor to make sense of these collections of whale species these collections of what was believed to be mythology and the interests of conservation. And what we came up with is that it is possible to incorporate many voices and diverse interests in a way that enables people to move through and appreciate that diversity and then make up their own mind about really whether it is mythology or not. One of the stories to, in some ways, validate the cultural story that was presented, the story of a Māori community, was this idea of, could people really ride whales? Is this what a museum should be promoting, the mythology of a culture? Now, what we discovered is that there were at least 4 stories of oral history that made mention of people riding whales. And over the development of the exhibition, we were introduced to a Māori woman who lived on the coast in a coastal community who had ridden a whale. And of course, I think there was some scepticism by those who were contributing to this research. And like all good things, it requires some validation. There was more than one person and there were 2 witnesses. So we included this story of a Māori woman who had riding a whale, from the beach to an island not far from where she lived. Now, in her own family stories, this happened in the early days of her people arriving in that part of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so we know that with the Te Papa experience, that sometimes mythology is reality and that sometimes mythology is part of the experience. At Te Papa we were able to combine then that not everything is just about what happened in the past, that nations can change their mind over time and move from one state to another and move from a whaling nation to that of a conservation interest. One final point before my time is up is that whale taonga, I didn't bring one with me, were so prized possessions. And I've often wondered, why is a whale bone far more prized than a pounamu or greenstone necklace? And it was told to me that often whales communicate, and we know this, they communicate with each other. But on these coastal areas, they would come ashore when they were in need of some help or care. We've seen this recently in New Zealand with lots of whale strandings in different parts of Aotearoa. And that when they arrived, when they were beached, that the Māori communities had preserved or retained a special ceremony just for these whales, and that no, it wasn't for a commoner or any person that was in the village to be part of that, but they were just for those who were special people. So all the objects that are made from whalebone, which we have in our collection, that are part of this exhibition, showed just how important these whales were to bringing people to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to being part of their culture, and enabling those early whalers who too had a research interest to make sure that they were going to carry on living over time, and how that research has contributed now to the research associated with conservation. Just a few thoughts. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you very much, Michelle Hippolyte. It's fascinating to hear about whale riding. Didn't some kid in WA just get into heaps of trouble for jumping on the back of a southern right whale? We do things differently here. Well, our world is different in so many ways, isn't it, to the world in which many of our museums were created. The great leap for mankind in our era is, of course, digital technology. Stephen Heppel is speaking now about what we want technology to do as more and more of our museums' collections are digitised. Stephen, welcome.
Good evening, and hello, listeners, whatever time it is you're listening, podcasters and so on. Actually, I love Whale Rider. It's one of my favourite movies. I'm lucky enough to be a BAFTA film judge, so I get to, around about this time of year, I have to watch all the movies, and I get to walk down the red carpet with the stars. Nobody knows who I am, so it's a joy for me, and I get to go to all the parties. Last year, the nominees' party. I spent a lot of time talking to Mickey Rourke about grandfather clocks. He turns out to be a very quiet gentleman, and I'm building a grandfather clock, and when I read the newspapers the next day, it was Mickey the Hellraiser, and clearly a completely different narrative. And I think what we learn from all this is that everybody has their own narratives. One of the difficult things for us with collections of all sorts is how do we enable everybody's voice? How do we give them the democracy of contribution? It's really important. I can pick out a couple of little projects we've run to try and illustrate that. I ran a project with our biggest supermarket chain, Tesco, back at the turn of the millennium. This was a long time ago now, back in the last century. And we asked children all over the country to do a whole lot of things online. We asked them to go and find the most famous person where they lived and capture the story of their school days. We asked them to find the oldest person where they lived and get their earliest recollections. I remember a group of children went to visit a very old chap down on the south coast, and they all arrived on their bicycle to interview him. He said, gosh, when I was a boy, I used to cycle down that hill you've just come down. I was a little bit naughty. Used to go too fast on my bicycle. The kids started to look quite interested, and he said one day I fell off my bike and went under the bus, and they looked quite alarmed. And then he said, and I so nearly went under the hooves, and you suddenly realise it was a horse-drawn bus, and suddenly they were. It was like being in a time machine. They'd been taken back into they blinked and the world was sepia in the most lovely way. When they talked to stars, I remember them chatting to Liz Hurley about her school days, which were scurrilous. I mean, she spent most of her time playing kiss chase and falling off bars in a drunken stupor, as far as I could make it, allegedly. What was fascinating was that the insights that the children gained were not valued by journalists. The kids came up with all sorts of scandals about famous people, but none of that made it into the press because that's just children's work. They had no sense of how valuable they could be as journalists and reporters. And I think key thing for our museums is to somehow build that parity of esteem of contribution where we really do value what everybody says and the contributions they make. I've been talking earlier at the museum's conference about a project we ran with the Victoria and Albert Museum in London called Every Object Tells a Story, where we encourage people to not just tell the stories of the objects that they presented, but to capture them on video. And at the end of the project, had a little taxi cab driving around Britain, driving into villages and women's institutes and some really quite tough areas, and saying to people, do you have objects that are precious, that you have a story to tell? And people were queuing around the block to bring their object and their story and make their contribution. We had people sitting in the cab weeping, with a precious object that told the story of their father or their partner. I mean, it was genuinely moving. And I think suddenly we realised, of course, that our museums weren't collections at all. They were catalysts of narrative that were curated. But, of course, the valuable items were out there with everybody. Everybody in this room, everybody listening to this broadcast has a great story to tell about objects that are part of their life. And that is our collection that we share. And giving voice to those narratives is hugely important because in a world where cultures feel disenfranchised by poverty, by geographical location. Giving voice to the history that we all share is hugely important. The internet, I'm here to talk about technology, of course, but the internet is built entirely wrong, isn't it? It's built around the universal resource locator, the URL, that dotty academics like myself, I suppose, thought we would know each other by our publications. I would find you by your papers and you'd find me by my website, which of course is completely foolish. We find each other as people, and the internet has no universal person locator. So we spend a lot of time on the internet trying to create ourselves as people, trying to put up our podcasts and our blogs and say, look, this is me, this is where I am. But fundamentally, the thing is a publishing engine, and it's not a communication engine, so we graft communication onto it. What you sense changing with technology, of course, is people have subverted the technology to be able to keep in touch with I was sitting here as we started, just checking out on my friends and pals around the world on Facebook and Twitter, and seeing what they were doing. Some of them are just getting up in the morning, some of them are just getting to the end of a long day, and they're in different time zones, but we have that sense of community. So, hugely important in all this is that sense of membership that we all share. And perhaps the last thing to say is just, it's really helpful, I think, to think about the me, we and the see in all this. Most of what you do, most of what you narrate, most of what you annotate, most of what you collect, most of what you thread and conjoin has a me dimension. My stuff, my information, my stories, my narratives, my culture, my context. But we also have a wee bit, which is our community, my family. Look how your own family has been radically changed by communications. You go back 10, 15 years, you were barely in touch with your extended family, let alone the dim, distant corners of nephews and nieces. Now, I know what all my nephews and nieces are. I know where they are, who they're snogging, what their joys and dreams are. It's wonderfully reconnected. And so that wee bit is very powerful. Then, of course, there's the see bit that we've delivered for a long time with broadcasting. But the challenge, I think, for our museums and our collections is how do we go from that see bit to enable the memberships of the community, the collegiality, the mutuality of that wee bit, and how do we go from there to the privacy and intimacy of the me bit? And if we don't deliver on all three dimensions, we're excluding an awful lot of people. Just a wry smile to say, as I'm sitting here, a message arrives from my PA in England, who I think is just getting up, telling about the school day facing her son that he's just off to. So, what could be a better illustration of the sociologically connectedness of all this? It's a joy, but we need to move with it if we're going to embrace it and make the most of it. Thank you.